When contrast paint came out a few years ago, it seemed to be quite divisive. For some, it was a great way of dealing with their grey hordes, and for others, it was ruining the whole aspect of painting. While time and experience seems to have eroded many people's staunch views on the product, a new contender has appeared that threatens to shake things up a little. Speed paint is a new range of one-coat acrylics from the Army Painter, and is essentially their response to contrast. It took a while to get to market after contrast was released, but we can hope that they've used this time wisely to perfect their product. Much like GW's contrast, its intention is to be used in a single thick coat over a white or other light base colour. As it dries, it should pool into recesses and pull away from the edges to create the appearance of highlights, midtones and shadows, without the need for additional paints. Now, Army Painter kindly sent me a sample of these new paints to try out, and in this video, I'll be directly comparing them to contrast. I have prepared two pairs of identical models and will be painting them in the same equivalent colours and with the same techniques to get the fairest comparison between the two. And before we go on, let me just state that the point of this video will be to provide you with a better understanding of the differences and similarities between the products. I am going to be as objective as I can here and allow you to make up your own mind on which you prefer. Now, before I grab my brush, let's first look at the bottles. Contrast comes in the standard Citadel paint pot style, albeit a little larger than your regular paints and smaller than the wash pots, 18mm to be exact, or 0.6 fluid ounces in freedom units. Speed paint comes in the exact same quantity, but instead of a pot, it comes contained within the Army Painter's standard dropper bottles. In addition to this, the bottle also comes preloaded with a ball bearing agitator. Now, in my experience, most people tend to prefer dropper bottles. They're easy to dispense from and are less likely to be knocked over, resulting in a non-oil spill. A rite of passage among Warhammer painters. Personally, I don't mind pots too much, but I do lean on the side of bottles. But the ball bearing agitators really make this for me. Many times I've found my contrast paint to be separated out at the bottom of the pot, requiring me to add my own agitators or risk repetitive strain injury. But apart from that, there aren't too many differences so far. So let's actually start using them. Here I have two identical Beast Snagger Orcs, which have both been primed white. The only area that I've painted are the metallics, and these have been painted with identical paints. As I only have 7 speed paints, I'll be painting this model using only those 7 colours, along with the closest approximations from the contrast range. As a result, it's unlikely that the final results will be beautiful compositions of colour, so just keep in mind that we're looking at the application and finish, rather than how good this orc will look overall. But before I go into how I painted them, here are the completed orcs. Without revealing which one is which at this stage, I want you to take a look at the results and decide which one you prefer, if any, without the bias of whether or not it was painted with contrast or speed paint. In fact, pause the video right now and leave a comment with your choice of either left or right. I'm interested to see which model you prefer the look of from a more unbiased standpoint before I reveal exactly which one is which. I started out with the yellows, Zealot Yellow from Speed Paint and Iron Yellow from Contrast, but instead of applying them in the one thick coat approach, I first added each paint to my wet palette. The dropper bottle of Speed Paint made it a little easier to do than the brush on that I had to use for the contrast. This paint was then diluted with some regular water. I wanted to see how easily each mixture could be thinned out with water and how it would change its application. I created a roughly half water, half paint solution for this. These diluted yellows were then applied to the orc's skin. Both fared well, with the pigments being evenly distributed across the white surfaces and not pooling up in patches. The yellow here would help to create a warmer tone that I could build upon with some green in the next step, as well as giving me the opportunity to see how paints worked when they were layered. I followed the yellow with some orc skin and orc flesh. With them both, I, unsurprisingly, painted the orc's fleshy skin. These were also added to the palette and thinned accordingly before being applied over the yellow that had been painted on in the last step. This helped to demonstrate the transparent capabilities of each paint. Both allowed some of the yellow tone beneath to show through, giving the green a slightly warmer hue, essentially helping to create a more realistic looking skin tone. Well, as realistic as you can get when you're painting something with bright green skin. Next, I began to use the paints in their true speed paint form. These were added to my palette but weren't thinned down before being applied. The first of these paints were Fire Giant Orange and Griffhound Orange. This was applied in a single thick coat over the scaled animal hide. This was a particularly good surface to test on. It had lots of peaks and troughs to give those auto shading and highlighting capabilities a good chance to work. It was at this stage that I first noticed a difference between the two parts. The speed paint, when unthinned, had more of a gel-like consistency to it. It was easy enough to spread around the surface, but generally felt more viscous than the contrast paint, something I would experience with the rest of the range too. From here, I then tackled the trousers and the material around the wrists using some Gravelord Grey and Basilicanum Grey. You may have noticed that my application here wasn't overly careful or precise. In my aim to recreate the techniques that these paints were designed for, I tried to keep things quick to see how well they work for those looking to actually speed paint their models. The leather areas were then painted with dark wood and wildwood. It was at this point that I started to notice some clearer differences between the two products. These darker colours began to highlight how much stronger the staining effect of speed paint is compared to contrast. The recesses remained pretty much the same, but the flat areas of speed paint generally appeared darker, particularly over the trousers that I painted with the greys. The final step was to paint the remaining armour panels, and for these I used Cloudburst Blue and Leviathan Blue. This step was also another good example of differences in the paint's consistency. It was subtle, but it did feel as though the speed paint covered further and so required less reloading of my brush. And here we have the completed orcs once again, with the speed paint orc on the left and the contrast orc on the right. With everything painted, I could quite clearly see the difference in consistency that I'd begun to notice earlier. The speed paint tended to leave more of a solid colour across the surfaces, whereas the contrast surfaces looked a little more washed out. They were also a little more patchy. I expected this across the skin where I'd use water to thin it out, but even when I applied one thick coat, it still didn't dry evenly. This was noticed mainly over the trousers. But I wasn't quite done with the orcs just yet. Out of personal interest, I wanted to see what a heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade would do to the look of each model, and so set about applying the same paint in the exact same way to both models. After giving them a chance to dry, I was left with two models that seemed a little closer together in appearance, albeit with a few surprising changes. By adding a darker shade to the speed paint orc, I'd actually toned down that saturation it had before. On the other hand, the colours on the contrast orc looked a little richer. My guess is that the recessed areas of the speed paint model weren't quite as dark as that created by the contrast paint. Therefore, by comparison, the surfaces didn't look quite as lightly coloured. As soon as I introduced a darker shadow, this became more apparent. This theory also sits in line with my experience of speed paint's thicker consistency when compared against the less viscous contrast paint. The more gel-like consistency would allow the paint to stay on the surfaces rather than pooling in the recesses like the contrast had done. But using as intended isn't the only way you can use these paints. In fact, I regularly use contrast paint in quite a few other ways too, so it's only fair that I compare how the paints work in other applications as well, using some fresh models. I often use contrast paint through my airbrush. I find that its strong pigmentation but translucent nature works well for achieving subtle transitions of colour over light surfaces, so both paints were added to my airbrush along with a few drops of airbrush thinner. I'd recommend slightly more thinner than paint here, in a ratio of about 60% thinner to 40% paint. This mix was then lightly sprayed across my Carrick acolytes from a low angle. This caused the paint to only form on the lower areas and steadily increase its intensity over a few layers. Again, much like when I thinned the mixtures earlier, there was little discernible difference here. Both paints could be applied evenly and allowed me to achieve some smooth transitions. With the same blue paints, I then tried directly applying the paint into recesses in order to emphasize certain shadows in the musculature of the models. I once again added a little water to the paint, but not quite as much as I did with my earlier yellows and greens. With a fine-tipped brush, I then directly applied the paint into the recesses before feathering it out into the surrounding surfaces. It was here that I found that the main downside to the speed paint's thicker consistency. It just felt a little too grainy. Not enough to make this task impossible, but it didn't allow me the same kind of subtle shading that the contrast paint afforded me. And the finished results reflect this too. The lines that I'd added with the speed paint are more discernible, and the points of feathering have a slightly more jagged appearance. And I think that this highlights the main difference between the two products. I think that their differences, although small, will make a big difference to how I use these products going forward. Which brings me to the conclusion and the point in the video where I'm supposed to give my verdict over which one is a better product. Which one you should go out and buy the full range of. But after trying them both out and directly comparing them, I can't definitively say that one is better than the other. It probably sounds like a cop-out, and in a way it is, but these paints don't really outperform each other enough on an overall basis. If you look at these products purely on their speed painting capabilities, then I would pick speed paint over contrast. But for the more subtle applications like glazing and fine detail work, then I'd stick with contrast. Which one you prefer is essentially down to the style of painting you prefer. There are of course differences outside the actual paints themselves, like the containers they come in. Myself and many others find dropper bottles to have an edge over pots, but again, that's highly subjective. What isn't subjective though is the price. With speed paint coming in at $4.50 in a pot compared to contrast $7.80, which again lends itself to the speed painting market well, especially if you're looking to paint a large amount of models with these. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, I tried to be as objective as I could be. I don't have any personal stake in either of these paints doing better than the other, but ultimately it's better for us, the actual painters, to have options. So I hope that I've presented enough information here to help you make a more informed decision yourself. There is of course the caveat that I haven't compared every single paint from both ranges because I was limited to only having 7 paints from the speed paint range. So if it's something you'd find helpful, then maybe I could do a more thorough range comparison in the future. Now before I go, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has stuck with this video to the end, even though it wasn't a kit bashing guide. I'd also like to say a big thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Ryan Little, Stuart Smith, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Dakota the Destroyer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Matthew Chilamidos, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that help to keep this channel going. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.